Hey, I'm Andy. I'm a cartoonist. I live in sunny Vermont. I've been doing this for about 5 or 6 years. I have a graduate degree from the Center for Cartoon Studies. I do horror comedy, every single permutation of these two genres. And I'm just here to try to make you laugh and think about life and get sad and stuff.
I love it. Okay, my name is Mary Widdicks. I live in Champaign, Illinois. I am 37. I have 3 kids, 3 dogs, and 2 cats, and clearly not enough sense to not have that many creatures living in my house. I was a psychologist before, staying home with my kids for 10 years. I've been writing off and on really that whole time that I was home, but I would say more like professionally in air quotes for maybe the last 5 years, something like that.
Yeah, so similar boat.
Yeah. And so I've worked as a journalist and a novelist. I write psychological suspense thriller type novels. So not
Nice.
far off from your horror genre there.
Oh yeah, there's lots of tension and suspense and good
Exactly.
stuff.
Exactly. So yeah, so I guess we thought we would just kind of run through some questions from our readers, followers that might be interesting to everybody. So I guess the first question, and I'll let you answer it first, Andy. How did you get started in your creative field, and were you formally trained? You mentioned grad school, so.
Yeah, it's weird because there's this whole thing with cartoonists where it's like you never consciously start deciding to make comics. You just start doing it one day out of kind of nowhere, frequently when you're like a kid, and then you just keep doing it as an adult. And one series of circumstances or another, you're like, oh, I want to do this for the rest of my life.
Never grew out of this.
True. It's weird because I was a game dev before this and I got really burnt out.
Okay.
But that's because I graduated the year Gamergate started, so that
Okay.
was like a whole thing.
I'm
But
not familiar with Gamergate.
do
I'm
not become familiar.
Comicsgate.
Imagine a very similar situation there.
Okay.
Yeah. But it was just like a really toxic work environment and game community environment. Like the year was 2010. Most people kind of like,
Yeah,
yeah.
sort of just like a resistance to move to more progressive ideas within that.
Yeah, and it was getting like really extreme to a certain extent, you
Yeah.
know?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
But
okay.
um unrelated to Gamergate, I got laid off when the company downsized and then they re-upsized without me, which
Oh, yeah, right.
but
That's
while
it.
I was unemployed, I made so many comics and
Maybe that was the best thing, right?
it's true. So before I like got another job, I was like, holy crap, this is going way better than game dev ever went. Like things are happening and I went to grad school and
That's
snowballed over here.
awesome. And I noticed on your website that you have a literary agent. So did that happen quickly right away once you decided to kind of pursue comics, or was
I
it something
wish.
that happened later?
That happened, I think, last November. So this is my 1 month anniversary of meeting my agent, but it happened because of Twitter, of all things.
Okay,
So,
that's not uncommon. There's entire events on Twitter for the literary sort of side of things
right.
where they do like pitch wars and things like that, where you
Yeah,
get
yeah.
a book in a sentence.
Yeah, I did a DV pit, which is like,
Yeah.
yeah, one of those pitch events. And I met an editor at Oni who then like introduced me to my agent because I kept getting screwed over by like, presses and stuff. Cause I don't know what I'm doing when it comes to business. I'm here to make the pictures.
Well, this is it. This is a problem for creatives in general, that people just think, well, you just want to get your stuff out in the world because you're an artist, so you can't possibly expect to get paid for this.
Right. And it's like hard to get yourself in that mindset, like, wow, my stuff actually has value. I should
Right.
read
And
this.
they're not doing you a favor by publishing it. You're doing them a favor by letting them publish it and then sell it. That is
Right.
a hard mindset to get into.
Is that like a similar thing with prose as well? Like, without me,
Absolutely.
there's no book.
Absolutely. Both in fiction and nonfiction, because I've had experience doing both. And in both of those areas, it's like you find yourself just begging, like, oh, please take this piece. I'll take anything. I'll take $50. Just, take this article. And then you think, you know what? Like, I'm providing a service that other people couldn't necessarily do. And I really should be like, if I think this is a $500 article, that's what I should sell it for. And it's a really hard thing to do.
Right, because the other thing is like if you don't do it, someone else is going to come in and charge that amount, and that person could be you.
Right, exactly. In fact, I can't remember where I heard it, but that's like the mantra, why not me?
Right.
And
That's great
why not?
advice.
And also the counter side of that is why me? So like what can you bring to something that no one else can? Because that
Right.
also helps you stand up for this is worth something because I have something to say that not anyone can just come in and do.
Right. Like I bring all the stuff to the table and here's exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Um, yeah, so I'll kind of move on. So I came into writing from a different angle, I guess. I kind of came in through the back door, which is it never really, I'd always done it. I'd always written since I was a little kid, just for fun, stories, things like that. Never really thought of it as like a legitimate career. So I went all the way through school. I got my bachelor's, I got my PhD in psychology. That was what I was going to do. And then I got pregnant with my oldest son when I was 5 months pregnant when I defended my PhD dissertation.
Oh
So
wow.
there I was, I graduated with my 3-month-old in tow.
Right.
And I'm like, I'd always sort of intended to stay home. So then it was in this moment where I was like, well, I guess I kind of did that whole thing and I'm not really going to do anything with it for a while. And I ended up choosing to stay home and I did for 10 years. And I was really happy with that choice. And it was incredibly stifling. And it was about 7 years ago. So my middle son was a baby and I'd already been staying home now for like 3 years. I was like, I have to do something. Like, I don't know what it is because I'm tired all the time and I have babies all over me, but I got to do something. And I came across like some of these like parenting blogs, like the mommy blogs
Oh
on
yeah.
the internet, and just funny stuff that was making me laugh just about how crazy it is to have babies. And I thought to myself, like, okay, maybe I could do something like that. People tell me I'm funny. Sure, why not? So I actually started as a humorist and I started writing parenting humor. And I did that for a while. And it was the first time I realized that people would pay me to do that. I was like, I can just write weird thoughts that come into my head and someone's
Right.
gonna pay me for that? That's amazing. So I went there. I graduated to doing more researched articles. Like I went from what I thought of as a blogger to a journalist. I was doing research, I was doing op-eds, I was doing things like that. And then finally graduated to novels, which is what I really wanted to do. And I had a literary agent for a while. Kind of went through that traditional process right up to it. We didn't sell my first manuscript. It got really good sort of responses and there wasn't a place for it. And
Yeah.
I decided at that point that I was going to take the leap it was important to me to get it out in the world. So I just
Oh
went
yeah.
self-published. So I've kind of been partially down that traditional publishing route. And then I've also gone the other way.
Nice. You've got like simultaneous experience.
Yeah, a little bit.
But honestly, it's more important to get your book out there than to have it, stuffed in a trunk for all time.
I agree. And there comes a point where some of the feedback that I was getting, I had to make a decision between, do I want to change something that felt important to me about why I wanted to write this book in the first place to make it more to market? Or do I want to just say, I'm going to put out there the way that I wanted it to be originally and just see what happens? There's always another book. There's always another idea.
Right.
I wasn't really ready to compromise on that. And that was kind of it for me.
No, I totally respect that. Like, why put a book out there if it's not your book?
Not the one you want to write. And,
Yeah.
maybe everyone was right. And it just didn't hit a niche in a market that was going to just blow up. And still, that was what I wanted to do. That was what I wanted to write about. So
Right.
I have a series now of novels with a very unlikable protagonist. And
Yes.
it meant something to me. I wanted her to be unlikable. I wanted the narration to be like that, to be dark, to be sort of, I wanted people to get pulled along even though they didn't like her. And I am still glad that I did that.
That's awesome. I like unlikable protagonists. Honestly, like when people have no flaws, I mean, that's a pet peeve, but
I agree. And as irritating as it was, more than once, I got the feedback from editors that if the protagonist had been a man, it would have been more acceptable. But because she was a woman, people expected her to be softer and be more likable. And that just made me not want to change it even
That's
more.
unacceptable. Like,
Right, exactly. Like this idea that, because we have novels, especially in this sort of thriller genre, where you have these slightly unreliable, unlikable female narrators, but they're a very certain kind of unlikable usually. They're the sort of, they're alcoholics, or they're broken and sad, and they're being gaslighted. They're all of these
right.
things. Whereas I went a different direction, and my main character isn't a more male version of that. She's just cold and hard and sees the world with these very dark sort of. She's like a female Dexter. It's that
Oh,
sort
nice. Yeah.
of sociopathic sort of. And also, she has reasons for being that way too that come out throughout the book. And so I just thought, like, why can't a woman deal with trauma that way instead of,
Right.
a different way? So that
If
was my
anything, yeah, we don't have enough female characters going in that specific route either. I mean,
right. I mean, obviously, we don't want people going in that route
well,
anyway.
no, I mean,
Like,
fictional.
right, fictionally. I like to think of my fiction stuff as like, if they're all thought experiments. It's like, what can I do with this concept? Like, here's this
Right.
character that I thought of, like, what can I do to them to make this an interesting story?
All fiction is speculative fiction.
Yes, I like that. Okay, so kind of transitioning down, do you have certain comics, certain things which are the closest to your heart or more personal to you, or do you put all of yourself into everything?
I'd like to say that all of my babies are equally loved, but that's not true. Jed the Undead holds a very special place in my heart, and every single part of the Jed the Undead universe, it's this thing that me and my best friend have been concocting since we were 19.
Okay.
And yeah, it's just sort of the platonic ideal of teen angst, I guess. Like, imagine every single high school drama you've ever seen, and also exactly how you felt at that time, kind of explored in a super deep divey way. And I think I just got really, really, really attached to the characters, and you know, you just fall into a world, I think.
Love, and I had a look at that, the one that was up on your website from
Oh
Jen,
yeah.
and I love this idea of marrying the mundane, everyday angst of what it is to be a teenager, and then having that supernatural element to it, where
Oh yeah.
it's also not mundane, but it feels mundane to him. Like, it's just so interesting.
Right. I love being really literalist about that sort of thing because I think it's way more interesting, you know?
Yes, I agree. So yeah, I can understand why that might feel very personal and kind of an interesting way to work through your own experiences as well.
Yeah, it's like you don't really realize what it's about until you're done writing it. You know what I mean? Whenever
Yeah,
you finish a piece.
yes, absolutely. I have a really hard time pitching stories before I've written them, because I
Yeah.
feel like for me anyway, they take on a life of their own, and then I don't know where that's going to go until I'm done with it.
Sometimes a through line just like becomes apparent.
Yeah,
Like,
yes, exactly. I have a sort of similar, my most recent novel, which isn't out. It's just sitting there needing to be edited, and it's terrible, but pandemic, and my kids are homeschooled. So this is what I'm doing at the moment. But the plot itself is not autobiographical, but huge portions of the world building and some of the character building and certain aspects of it I pulled directly from my own childhood. So there's this really eerie, uncanny feel for me as I'm writing it, of like, the house that all of these things are taking place in is my house that I grew up in, down to the smell, to the carpet, to everything. And it's the first time I've done that, where I've really, characters often share my voice, but this was the world and these experiences, and things as small as like, what do you do in this small town when there's nothing to do and you're 16? Where do you go? What are the things you do? And pulling that from my own childhood. So to me, there's something very personal about that.
see, I love that stuff. I love reading people's version of that, you know? It's like a little window into like what mattered the most to them or what currently matters the most in a way.
Yeah. And it's often on a level below the plot, which I
Oh yeah.
think is so interesting. It's the subtext that really pulls from a person's life and their soul. Um, So let's see. Do you, by the sounds of it, I think you do you work full time as a cartoonist? Is that your day job?
It is my day job, but until super recently, I had a day job for like, I've had a day job for ever
Yeah.
until a couple months ago. I
Okay.
actually quit my job right before the pandemic, so here I am.
Right? Exactly. We're all kind of in that now what do we do place.
Yeah, like, well, now this is my day job, kind of
Right?
yeah, because I
And
wasn't gonna show up and go work at the copy shop and talk to, well, there's also got to this point where I was trying to decide between taking more shifts at my day job and taking more clients, and I was like, well, what am I doing here exactly?
right. What do I really want to do and what gets me where I want to be?
Right.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah. I'm glad I got to that point though. Like I worked a lot of weird day jobs.
Have you like trying to just make ends meet so that you could continue doing the comics?
Yeah, like when I wasn't working in the games industry, which is super, super draining and doesn't really leave you a lot of time to do other stuff.
Yeah,
I was doing like, selling bicycles was one I had. I cannot ride a bike, so
that's hilarious.
I'm your guy.
So many creatives who have had to do that. And this goes back to the like, we are not paid what we deserve for what we do. Because people having to like go garage sailing and then turning stuff around on eBay just to get by in this industry. And it's just, it's unfortunate because putting that much pressure doesn't give yourself time to really be creative. That takes
Right.
time. And
Yeah,
like,
I think that when the pressure's on to make money, there's not a lot of room to like flex your arms because you're always worried about if I make someone mad or screw this up, then,
right,
what?
or to explore something that you haven't done before. Because, well, what if I start writing this or I start drawing this and I get into a corner and I can't get out of it and I just want to let it go? You're like, well, if I've wasted 6 months of my life and I need this, you can't do that. And so you stop
Right.
taking risks, which I think is important when you're a creative.
Yeah, like, you never want to be stuck in a rut, but sometimes you got to work in that rut to like make things happen and, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, let's see. Did you always know that you wanted to be an artist? And do you
Uh,
have any advice for people who might want to?
hmm. I don't think I always knew I wanted to be a cartoonist, but I always knew I wanted to like, make stories, write stories, draw them, however that may be. I
Yeah,
knew I always wanted to make people laugh. So that's something like I figured out as many kids do, if I make them laugh, they'll stop bullying me probably. So it
mhm, that's
generally kind of works. So it definitely works a lot better in high school than it does in elementary school.
yeah, or
But
middle school. Middle school is just horrible no matter what.
I think everybody has a terrible time in middle school, which is wild because what are we all doing?
Oh, I know. My oldest is going to go to middle school in like a year and a half, and it's just terrifying to me.
Oh man.
Just like
Yeah, everyone
thinking
is
them
just
into the
like,
fire, you know.
did
Um,
you always know that you wanted to write?
I always knew I was drawn to it, and I always knew that it was something that came very naturally to me. But I did not ever really think of it as being a thing that I could do with my life until a lot later. And I wish that I had. And so like the advice that I would give to people is like, if that's what you feel, if that's what feels natural to you and that's what feels right, start it because it takes time to build that up.
I
And
completely agree.
I occasionally look back and think like, oh man, if I'd have started doing this in college before I had kids, like my route to getting to where I want to get to would have been far more direct. And it would have been different and who knows how that would have gone. And there's so many opportunities that I think I can't relocate to go to this program or I can't just travel to this place to write this article because I
Right.
have these other responsibilities. And I wish that I could have just given myself to that for a while.
Yeah, because like they kind of drill it into your head when you're growing up that you should choose like a suitable profession that you're likely
I was going to be a doctor. That's what I was going to do, like, because anything else wouldn't be acceptable,
right, like that's like the top tier somehow. But then
somehow.
you look around and you're like, obviously people are succeeding at the thing that I want to do. And if I had put all my time into that instead of this suitable thing that I may not be super into, like who knows where I'd be.
Right? And there's less money in the creative industry, and that's not really, and again, this is something I realized later in life, that that's not really what it's all about. And you can have
Yeah.
all the money in the world and be absolutely miserable if you're not doing something that feels fulfilling to you.
Right. Like I'd rather wake up every day and be really excited about my job and love what I do rather than, haul myself into a 12-hour shift where I,
Right.
yeah.
Well, and just my personal anecdotal experience, I have always spent less money and been less frivolous when I've been happy and excited about the things that I'm doing, because I'm not just bored and being like, I need to self-soothe on, Amazon
Right,
or
this
whatever
and that.
it is.
Yeah, like when I worked in game dev, I think I spent so much money on takeout that it was just like,
Right, because you get worn down and you don't feel like cooking because you're not energized at the end of the day. And
right,
and maybe this isn't true for everyone, and there's probably a lot of people who would share that experience.
for sure.
Uh, what would you say is the most challenging hurdle that you've faced in publishing?
Uh, Honestly, getting doors open. Like people don't talk about it enough, but like you can be really good at what you do. You can be really driven at what you do, but unless you get really, really lucky and happen to be at the right place at the right time, sometimes it just you got to keep slamming yourself against the door until it happens to be open at that particular moment.
Like a bird in a window.
Yeah, just like come on, now's my chance.
One of these days the one won't be there. Yeah, I would agree with that completely. It's networking is so much more important than I think people realize, especially like you think of business as being a networking thing, and I think creatives tend not to think of what they do as a business. And
Right.
it really is. The more opportunities you have, the more people that you talk to face, puts your face to a name, so that when you reach out to them, more doors are open to you. And yeah, and that's takes a while to learn that. And and it's why I was saying to Sarah that this small press fest, and she was telling me that this is partially was designed as a networking thing, which is just get out there, realize that there are people behind these comics and these
Yeah, because
books.
they're all really nice people. It's just a matter of like,
Most
you
of them.
know, it's true. This year's a weird year for it though, because I love meeting people at conventions, but this is not,
It's
a time
not
where I want to be.
conventions.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And we've all gotten very proficient at figuring out how to use Zoom and things like that. And in some ways, I find getting out of that comfort zone is almost a good thing. I am not a phone person and I am not a video call person. And I have learned how to do that over the last year.
nice. Me too. I'm always like, you can email me, text me, or meet up with me, but I am just not functional. Like, gonna get
And we're all in the same boat, which I think helps too, that none of us were used to doing this. So we all feel equally uncomfortable.
right. Yeah, which is like camaraderie.
Mm-hmm. What has been the most rewarding part of publishing for you?
Uh, Not to be cheesy, but knowing that I made a positive impact on someone because they read something that I wrote, like just because I write YA and that's
Yeah.
why I got into this whole thing,
I
is
don't think that's cheesy at all.
yeah, I just like, what mattered to me most when I was a teenager was that, and knowing that, I had that impact on at least one human being means everything in the world.
Absolutely. And art of all kinds, whether it's music or movies or books or comics, have this really cool universal appeal, and people are able to see themselves in it in ways that maybe they aren't in with other things.
Totally. Like,
I would agree with that completely, that the times that I have felt the most sort of fulfilled by writing has often been doing the articles and things. And I've written a lot about the psychology of parenting and things like that. And I'll get comments in and people just saying like, this was amazing. Like I thought I was the only person that this was happening to. And I'm so glad to see that someone else is doing that. And how did this work out for you? And do you have any thoughts? And that's that same feeling of like, oh, I made a connection to someone and that means a lot to me.
totally. Like I remember I did this reading at Chicago Zine Fest like I'm old, 5 years ago, and I'm not that old. I'm 27, 28. Geez, I am old.
I forget my age all the time, but I'm older, so
Nice. Yeah, watch me in 2 years being like 40. But I did this reading and this of my autobio comic Trans Man Walking, and this girl's mom walked up to me and she basically told me that she had been so like mean to her kid because she was carrying all this baggage from her mom and I had made her realize that. And that was the most incredible thing because like, you
Yeah.
know,
Was
like
her daughter going through some similar things, or was it just more
right,
of
her
like
daughter was
being on
trans
sort of
and
parent
her
level?
mom had like displaced all of this like phobia that she really didn't feel herself, you know? And it just like clicked. She was like, oh my God, I love my daughter way more than I love society. Like,
Mhm.
and
Yeah, and something that you put out in the world made somebody realize that, and that's
like
huge.
my dumb little jokes,
One's
you
life.
know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's awesome. Let's see. Well, question number 6 that I've got written down here is about self-publishing. I don't. Have you done self-publishing stuff as well as traditionally published stuff?
Right. So I started off self-publishing, and that's kind of how I started like meeting people.
Okay.
So I only very recently switched to like more traditional publishing. So
Okay. How does the self-publishing process work then for comics and zines and things like that? And then, because I only know it from the text-based perspective.
right. So it's a lot more common to like start off self-publishing in comics because that's the only way you can actually get people to look at your stuff.
Right.
Like just even as a portfolio piece, you gotta have a book, you know, like
Okay.
a complete story.
Yeah.
But a lot of indie comics is small presses, so I wouldn't probably not call that, you know, self-publishing, but it's kind of in the
Right.
same spirit. They don't edit your work. You're just, you know, they're facilitators who distribute kind of your complete idea.
Okay.
So
There are some small and indie presses within the prose sort of community which are similar.
yeah, so like that's kind of the whole, that's like a huge, you know, like backbone of indie comics. And then on top of that, you've got your big two, DC and Marvel.
Marvel.
And yep, and we all know about
Yeah.
their
Would you consider like something like Dark Horse? Is that an indie publisher, or is it like it's up there in that like second tier,
yeah,
right?
see, Dark Horse is interesting because they're creator owned, so you basically have complete control over your stuff, although you do work with an editor. But they are considered an indie company, but they're the biggest indie company, and you know they make more money than I think some of the traditional houses are making off of their graphic novels right now. So
Transitioned into television too with like the Umbrella Academy on Netflix. Like that's their baby too.
oh yeah, like I'm pretty sure that's how cartoonists are getting fed right now is
Yeah.
licensed.
I was born and raised near Portland, Oregon. So I've actually been kind of familiar with Dark Horse, and I
Oh,
had the opportunity to go and actually tour their little like headquarters about a year and a half ago. Very cool people. Like I
oh
really like the atmosphere. I have not necessarily heard such positive things about working for Marvel and DC.
yeah, like I've heard an array of things,
It's like,
but
buying free range farm fresh meat versus Tyson, you know,
yeah,
like
it's like you know, you go to the Walmart, you know what's happening.
they're just churning things through.
Yep. And like I have so much respect for artists and writers who work for Marvel because they're turning things through
Right.
so fast.
Yeah.
Like,
Right. And the expectations, the workload is high, the pay is low. And if you won't do it, they've got a line of people who will do it
right.
just because they're the name. You
Right.
know?
And the whole prestige thing I think is a little ridiculous because like you see that in game dev. I got told to my face multiple times, like, you know, you're lucky to be here because people would kill to just like be in your seat. And I'm like,
You're like,
oh,
okay, what am I supposed to do with that information?
like I'll just keep doing my job as best I can now.
Mhm.
But you know, the thing is, like, I totally was in that mindset, you know, when I was in college. Like, you know, I'm going to get the dream job, and I see everyone as competition for no reason at all. Nowadays, not so much. I love everybody. Comics as friends.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm trying to think if I have anything to add to that specifically about self-publishing. So I was surprised so I had gone down the traditional route first. And I will attribute that completely to my own like biases coming into this. Like I just thought that was the more like respectable way to go about it. Like someone's vetting it. Like this is how you're supposed to publish
Right,
books.
that's what people say, like, you know, the correct.
Such an antiquated way of looking at it now, but I just was too new. I was green at this and I didn't know any better. So I just hammered down that path and said, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm doing, even if it wasn't working for me anymore. once I made the switch, and and I was really lucky. I had a sort of cohort of other writers that we all kind of wrote our first draft of our first novel at the same time. And then two of them decided to publish indie, and I signed with an agent. And so we went down these diverging paths. And then I looped back around about 2 years later and was like, hey, got any advice for me? So I was very fortunate in some ways to be able to learn from, their experience. And they're both doing incredibly well and are incredibly successful at it. And so it's overwhelming when you start. And there are I've found a lot of resources out there that actually make it very easy. Once you get through the writing process, the editing process, things like that, formatting, not an issue anymore. Like, to me, doing the layout of a book seems like that used to be a job in and of itself. Right. And now there are programs. I have a program on my laptop and I just import a Word document and it just makes it look pretty for me.
See, that's the ultimate thing, is automation at that level.
Yeah, it allows the creative process to be just the creative process and not, anything else. The other thing, just, to pro self-publishing, is I like that I get to have control over the art, the cover art, things like that. I get to have control over the title. I get to, all of those little things, which, no, in the grand scheme of things, they don't matter. But I've watched so many of my traditionally published friends just railing against, like, oh, I hate what they did with the cover, or I hate this title, or having to make peace with it. And I just think, like, to be fair, I had help on my first 3 covers, but the concept was mine. And I found images that I wanted to use and then have them sort of altered and changed around and placed down. And then I learned how to do that for myself. And it's such a fun, I'm not a visual art person, and yet it's so much fun to get to do that part of it. It's like a break for me.
Yeah, like, honestly, it's fun to put the whole thing together. Like, every little tiny,
Yeah. It's very satisfying too, because it's all yours. You have done it, you've taken it from start to finish, and you created a thing. And I think that's really cool too.
Yeah, like, one cool thing I think my grad school did, I went to the Center for Cartoon Studies. Your final project is, not only do you have to draw and write your comic, but you have to physically create the book as it would look, or, as your package or whatever. And I wish I basically made this giant ritual box with, like, a Jed pentagram on it. You'd open it and there'd be the book, and it was
awesome.
all.
So is that where Jed the Undead was born? Was that your, like, graduate project?
That was where the first Jed comic was, like, completed, I think. Because a lot of it was just, like, kind of bandying stuff around with, my best friend, like, oh, what if this would happen? What if that would happen? And we had all these Word docs of stories that were not, like,
right.
We did some scripts, and those were, like, pretty great, but, like, nothing, like, visually happened until my thesis year. But yeah.
Yeah. So jumping off of that and kind of taking over a few of these other questions, like, all at once, let's talk about your writing process. So by the sounds of it, there was a big chunk of time that was kind of just thinking and brainstorming and things like that. When it came time, did you do a storyboard? Did you plot it out? Or was it like, go ahead and tell me how that process works for comics, because actually I have no idea.
Right. Well, I think that there's definitely a lot more plotting out after you figure out what your comic's going to be about. Like, that's mostly kind of design work. But, like, for me at least, I have an idea several years back, whatever year it is. I have an idea from old, and then it just kind of boils around. And one day I sit down and I write an entire synopsis for it. And that's like a little baby for a comic. Okay. And then from there, there's kind of like a agreed upon sequence of, like, pipeline actions that you kind of have to do to make comics happen. Okay. So from there, you generally take your synopsis and you divide it up into, moments and chunks and portions. You figure out, your dialogue and your actions, and then you divide that into your panels, your pages, and then into your panels. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of, like, construct a blueprint of it with thumbnails. So, like, I know some people who just go straight up, like, panel 1, this and this happens, but that has never clicked with my brain at all, like, for some reason.
Yeah. I get that. Maybe it's like a top down versus bottom up process type thing. Like, you're more,
like, I can't rather than, like, from 1 to 2,
Yeah, that's very organized.
Nice. Yeah. So, like, I think what I end up doing is, like, I just take these, like, big stabs at general swathes of the comic that I know want to happen. So I
Yeah.
take these like story cards and I'm like, like Jed gets dumped at the prom and he's super sad. Freddie doesn't care and like all this other stuff. And then I articulate on those moments and then eventually it kind of expands into a graphic novel.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I
Kind of
think it's a lot like screenwriting,
moments.
you know. Yeah.
Okay.
How
That's
about
interesting. And when you do your synopsis, how long would you say, like how much chunk of actual like material is that?
oh man, depending on the book, it usually ends up being like dozens and dozens of pages of exactly what happens. I have a weird habit of like not doing anything or like slightly planning it and then sitting down and like in like a trance state and just like writing an entire
Brain dump.
yeah, just like ugh. And then comes the like, and this is totally the game designer in me, the planning part where you're like, like systematically, here's the like motifs that need to visually keep appearing in the book. Like, here's the color story for this chapter because it needs to be like, dull because they're sad. And I keep using sad as an
There's
example.
so many more layers to it when you're dealing in the visual arts too, which I find really interesting. That planning level that can go into it. You're telling the story with not just the dialogue or the events that are happening, but also with facial expressions and with the color and with things going on in the background. And
Right.
time can shift in weird ways. And it's a much fuller realm of information that you can give to the reader in a very short time period.
Yeah. Have you read Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud? Everyone brings this book up as like the example of.
If I have, I've actually written articles about teaching kids to read via comics and why it's actually more suited for our brain and how we learn and how we process
Oh, so
information.
you totally, yeah.
I don't know if I'm sure I've come across it. I don't remember the text specifically.
Right. But it's basically the idea of visual literacy being, equally as important as literacy.
Uh, and if, I mean, important is sort of a
Well,
more natural is sort of what
yes.
I had come across, which is that we naturally encode information on like a visual spatial map in our brain. And then we have to take that information and translate it into back and forth from text. So some children, especially when learning to read, really struggle, especially kids on the spectrum, really struggle to make that translation. Whereas they can read comics and understand it because they're using different kinds of cues.
Right. You just have a much wider tool set, for expressing specificity.
Yeah, absolutely. And you start to pick up, there are, as you were sort of pointing out, there are sort of accepted patterns and structures too within that you can stick to while then, using this other tool set at the same time, which is kind of
Right.
neat.
Like comics definitely has a language,
Yeah.
and some of it's as simple as like if you see like angry lines coming out of someone's face, they're angry. But sometimes it's like a lot
Some
more subtle, like
some of them are strange. And I remember looking at a list of them when I was writing that article. And there were things like, I wish I could remember. It was like, a tear on one cheek meant a certain thing. And it wasn't sadness. It was something very different, and I can't remember now what it is. But it's like, it's its language in and of itself. And it takes a while to actually become literate in that language.
right, yeah, because I mean, I think a lot of people are literate in that language, but they maybe don't even realize it. Like people who read comics or like watch like films like all their life, they have this like lexicon, but they may not have like actually
Right.
thought about using the
Well,
word.
and again, translating it into a verbal explanation of it is again going from that visual spatial space to a text based thing, really.
Right,
I
which
mean,
I think is super interesting.
language based, I guess, is a better way to put it rather than text. We have to make that translation. And sometimes you can understand something on a non-verbal level and then really struggle to explain it.
Right, yeah. Well, picture worth a thousand
It's
words.
a challenge, I guess, for those of us who do work in the language only based art, which is how do you do that? How do you capture all of those things in the background and then try to bring that through with nothing but language?
Right, like how do you get the full flavor, without making the food?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I have and I'm going to call it a nasty habit because honestly it is. I am not a plotter in any way, shape, or form. I have to force myself to do it. And I hate it every time I do. I tend to start with either a character or if I'm really being like self-destructive, it will be an atmosphere or even like a feeling or a song or something that I'm like, I want to make that experience into a story, and how do I make that transition? And I start building from that place, which makes it really fun for me. I enjoy the process of writing a first draft. When I write like that, is this really cool experience, almost like watching a movie as I'm writing, because I don't know what's going to happen. And I'll get, the chapter before, and I'll throw like a little mini tantrum. So like, that person has to die. I didn't want that to happen, but it's out of my hands now. I can't help it.
Right, like it's been made apparent.
Right. And I didn't know that was going to happen. And there's something really cool about that, like you're creating life, you're playing God in a way when you do it that way. And it makes the process of editing hellish because I don't know where it's going. And I've written entire manuscripts, 80,000 words, where I look at it afterward and I'm like, there's no plot here.
Like I've evoked something.
But there is, but it's not, there's an accepted structure that novels tend to follow. I mean, certainly they vary by genre, but generally speaking, you've got your 3-act sort of, curves and your A plots and your B plots and things like, and if you don't go through initially and plan that out, you might have your midpoint at page 50 instead, or, at page 300, and you're going, I didn't balance that right. And
this is why I do the index cards, because I have made that mistake a gazillion times.
I will show you, I was laughing as I was preparing for this because I have props. This is what I have done to myself as a way of avoiding that. I have an old Amazon box that I have divided into 3 sections, which are my 3 acts, and I put Post-it notes on there. And that is how I plot.
I do the same thing, but I put it up on the wall. I don't have a book going right now, but I basically just like get these little index cards and I like draw my little stick figures and up on the wall they go.
And they make programs that will do that for you. Scrivener, I know, is one of them, which literally has postcards, or not postcards, index cards like you're talking about. And they look like that, and you can move them around, and it's all digital. And I'm like, that's so cool. My brain just doesn't work that way. If it's not physically in front of me, I can't, it doesn't sit the same way. I edit on paper too. I do the same thing. I print off my books. I try to wait till it's almost done so I don't waste paper. And I will lay them out like chapter by chapter on the ground around me, like an FBI agent, like just like with the right. I don't think it's very efficient though.
But if it works, it works.
Yeah, well, it works some of the time. So we'll go with that. Let me see what else we have. Yeah, I feel like a lot of the questions, especially the ones from other people, had a lot to do with what the process was and how that sort of differed by, text-based things versus comics. Let me see.
I definitely think that like you're kind of forced to be more of a plotter in comics, even if you're like a pantser at heart, which I definitely am.
I can imagine that that's true because you do have to. Things are so much more compartmentalized in comic form. You have panels that fit on pages and they have to fit together. You can't have a panel that goes on to the other page that doesn't make a lot of sense there.
Right. Yeah, you could like write like that, but when it comes time to lay it out on the page, you actually have to make conscious decisions about fitting things.
And it's defined by physical space too, as opposed to a book, which my chapters can be however long I want them to be until I'm done saying what I want to say, and it's time to move on to the next chapter. Whereas that's not necessarily, you can do it to some extent, but you still requires more planning, because if you're going to add another panel, you have to add another page,
Oh yeah, and like if woe betide you if your last chapter ends on a like left-hand side page, but you planned the next one to be a spread, like it just.
And that's something I've never had to think about in part of the creation process, because I'm far less bound by physical space.
Right. It's interesting because, comics have gone digital. Most people have gone digital recently, but I sometimes work traditionally, and editing is completely nuts when you're trying to do that, because if you hand letter with ink and stuff, you got to like go in like it's the 80s with your little white out and redo it.
Yeah, right. How do you feel about the scrolling version of comics, things like webtoons, which bring that genre almost, it takes it out of that structure on the physical space, because now you're scrolling on to infinity?
I think that's a super cool like format because you can do a lot of interesting stuff with it. Like you can completely do away with the idea of panel borders and gutters and page borders. And like Emily Carroll does some amazing scroll comics and she does horror, so it's super atmospheric where she like messes with the background colors and like really gets you into the mood
Well,
as you
and then
scroll.
you get into this, and coming from game dev stuff too, like I presume this is something you're familiar with. You get into the space of like the physical act of scrolling sometimes as part of the experience of
Right.
the comic,
And you
which
can
is
dictate
also
people's
really
speed.
cool.
Yeah, which is like the spacing, and you can
Hmm.
give me all these ideas about making horror comics based on scroll speed now.
Well, yeah, and I think that's really cool. And just like the what does it do if a person has to scroll really far to get to the next panel? Does that change their experience of it? Does that give them a particular? Can you communicate that way?
Right.
Which
Like
I
you
think
could do a jump scare where you know it's gonna come, but
you don't
the
know.
wait is so specifically long that like, do I even want to scroll all the way down? It's this whole thing in games where you're making a horror game, you know there's gonna be a jump scare at the end of the hallway, but your character is forced to walk through it and you have to press the button. You have to be the one who like makes the scare happen.
Right. But and I've always thought that about video games in particular as a storytelling medium, which is that it gets the most interaction from the consumer of any of these arts, which is that you
Right.
have to do a thing to make the story continue, which I just think is really neat. And I think the scrolling comics is kind of a neat hybrid of that.
Oh, totally. There's all kinds of interactivity you can do nowadays. Like, I would consider visual novels to almost be like comics in a way as well, because
So
there's a lot.
visual novels in like a graphic novel versus a comic, or is that
Oh, in the game genre sense, it's
oh
this.
okay.
Yeah, I think they're Japanese in origin, but basically it's a choose your own adventure type of a thing. You know, you've got your characters, you've got your backdrop. It's
Okay,
what
I'm
it says on the
gonna have
label.
to clean that
Yeah,
actually, and I think that's a really cool idea. I would love to brainstorm for just for my own stuff, like how can we move traditional literature closer to something like that that can be interactive, and can you use the physical space as a storytelling mode as well? And I've only
yeah,
seen it done successfully a couple of times in books. Ones where things like the footnotes will communicate to you, where you're having almost a separate conversation through the
yeah. And
text
they're doing
via the footnotes versus the text that you're reading, and things like that, where you're it's aware of itself and its physical space, and it's using
right.
that as part of the story, which I just think is so creative and cool. And there's so many opportunities for that.
Oh, totally. I think that we've just like, barely scratched the surface, like as society on
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Well, and thinking of it as an interactive, like you're not just hammering a story at someone and saying like, here's what you're supposed to feel. You're letting
Right.
them get what they want from it, which requires in some way for them to be interacting with it and invested in it.
Yeah. Like there's a level of investment because, when you go to the movies, you sit there for an hour and a half and you have to watch the whole thing. But with
Right.
the book and with the comic and with the game, your reader can decide that they've had enough, which,
Mhm.
something that I'm always paranoid about, but they can always come back. It'll be fine.
And I suppose in theory, if you're hooking them, then
Then they read the whole book and they never got a chance to close it.
yeah, that would be a
Because
bummer.
comics are like, it takes you like 3 years to draw one, and then like it takes you 2 hours to read them, and
Yeah, it's amazing how much of an investment it is to work on a book of any sort, whether it's
oh
whether it's text based or whether it's visual art, which is that just you put so many hours, and I don't think I fully appreciated like. I can remember being in college and being told to write like a 2,000 word essay and thinking how like, oh my God, that's so many words. And now it's like a novel is 80 to 100,000 words. And I'm just like, that's so much time just spent,
yeah,
so many words just physically typed out on a page.
right. Like there is a physical expense to all of this because like
Yep.
yeah, I mean
Uh,
especially yeah, both writers and cartoonist writers hunched over their computers getting carpal tunnel.
yep.
Yep.
And banging their head against the wall. And that's just the actual time spent at the computer
Right.
typing or drawing or, whatever it is, let alone that like at least half the creative process is not physically putting something on a page.
Absolutely.
It's brainstorming, it's coming up with ideas. And that's something I've been toying with a lot lately, which is giving myself actual separate space for this is my creative day because I'm not in a good place to be, whatever it is, like, or I don't have time, or I don't have an opportunity, or I'm just tired. So today's going to be a creative day, and I'm going to make it okay that nothing gets accomplished this day. And by doing that and giving myself that permission, like, I find I have more ideas, and I'll just keep a notepad by me or my phone, and I'll take notes in there. And that's all I'll let myself do. That's it, nothing else. And then I have days where I'm like, today is my productive day. So now I can pull up those notes and I can say, here are all the ideas I had. What can I do with them? And then physically sit down to do that. Because I've made the mistake of like, I've got an hour, I better make something happen. And then nothing happens until the last 15 minutes because I spend the first 45 going, what am I going to write about?
Right. Like, I mean, you got to give yourself room to actually do the imagining part. It's so hard to remember. I got to start doing that. Like,
it's funny because like I think of them as being two parts of the same process, and they are totally different processes and totally different experiences. And if you try to force a productive day to be a creative day, you don't get as many good ideas.
You just wasted the energy of whatever day it is that you were gonna.
It's like you have to go with it. You have to go with the flow, ride whatever that is. If it feels like I'm like getting things done, then get things done. Don't waste that energy. But if you can't get things done and you're like beating yourself up because you're not getting any words today, what are you accomplishing there either? Let it just be okay. And probably things are going to occur to you. And then don't like, and I have to make myself not be like, oh, I had an idea. Let me go write that, no.
Right.
I'm going to make a note and I'm going to put it down and I will find it another day.
And on that day, I'll be so glad that I made this notebook happen.
Exactly. Now I just have to be more organized because I have like, my desk is just covered in like Post-it notes where I've written stuff down that I've had like an idea while I'm doing something else. And now they're all over the place.
Oh, I have my assorted various pages.
I have it too. Various Post-it notes. I have notebooks that have just like lines drawn across the page and like one sentence scrawled down of like a thought that I had that I want to come back to. I have them in my phone. And one of these productive days that I have, which isn't a creative day, is going to be, let me find a way that I can organize this so that I have a system for it. That's my non-creative brain. That's my organized brain. My left brain says, do that. And I'll have right brain days where I get to think of the ideas.
Totally. Like I got to start organizing my reference pictures because they're all just hanging out on my desktop. Like,
yes. And things like, anytime I do pictures, like I just let them go to my downloads folder on my laptop. And then I have to scroll through the one where it's like the last 30 days. I'm like, was it that one? No. Was it that one?
Oh, and you're like, at what time period was I working on this story?
Exactly. I organize my things autobiographically. Well, is there anything else that we did not cover from here or?
Oh, you know what? Because this is a evergreen question. How do you deal with a creative block / writer's block?
Oh, that is a good one. I mean, and I'll just go back and, my newest thing that I'm doing is that compartmentalization of those two things. So if I'm having writer's block and I can't make words happen, I'm just letting that be okay. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to use this Saturday to sit on my butt and play video games or, whatever it is.
Right. You need to recharge your brain.
Just put a notepad by me, once an hour or so. I just have like that's a great idea. And I'll just write it down and I go back to doing the other thing and I feel rested. And then I have all these ideas ready when I want to do something. So that's my new strategy and we'll see how it works. But
no, I think it's good. Like riding the wave of what you're actually going to be doing.
Yeah. What about you? Do you have like that creative block that you then have to shake it loose or do you wait for it?
I wait for it, but I have timed it out so that my week looks like 5 days of me just being like, and then 3 days of having a complete like nonstop comic making time. And
you have 8 days in your week somehow.
Oh, yep, I did. 4 and 3.
You're lucky. You get that extra day.
Yeah, no, but I've kind of figured out that like I'm not actually not doing anything on those days. What I'm doing is like percolating all these ideas in my brain because how else would I be able to sit down and just articulate all this stuff if I wasn't. And I noticed that I am thinking about it, when I'm like cooking or playing games or whatever. They fit in, if you're not staring at something all the time, it subconsciously swims around your brain and I think fits together in ways that you don't even expect.
And I think letting that be okay is like the biggest step, because if you're busy ruminating on how you're not doing things, then you aren't open to those ideas. You really
Right.
have to let it be okay. And I think creatives talking about that process helps people realize that we're all doing that same thing. Like no one, unless maybe you're Stephen King, sits there 5-6 hours a day and just bangs out 10,000 words every day, or or
Right.
whatever it is. Like it just doesn't work that way. And I was just watching a documentary the other day, and it was had a writer in it, and she was saying like, oh, I hate everything, and I just need to get this writing done. And this other person was commenting there saying like, you got to understand the writing process. And when you say that you need 5 hours to write, what you mean is you need 1 hour to write, and you need the other 4 hours to dig deep into the space, because good art and good writing comes from this deep, dark place inside of you. And you can't just turn it on and off. So
Right.
like the idea of letting yourself be okay with that when I say it's going to take me this long to write, I don't have to sit down and write that whole time.
Right. And, I think a lot of us think that people are going to assume we're not working if
We're lazy, or even like if you're like accepting a deadline. So I ran up against this a few times. Like I know that I can write an article in an hour. I know I can do it if I've done the research, things like
right.
that. And I have to be very careful not to promise things within a week, because just because I can get it done in an hour does not mean I'm going to be ready at any point during that 7 days that I've given myself. Like you really got to space that out, and it is okay. It's not being
Yeah.
lazy.
It's like you're going to do your best work if you give yourself that time. Just because you could doesn't mean you should, which is definitely something
Right.
that,
Well,
yeah.
and saying that you can write it or draw it or whatever it is in a certain time period is part of the problem, because you're not acknowledging how long did you spend from the point at which you conceived that thought to actually getting to where you could sit down and write. And if you had 6 hours, even if it's broken up over weeks, that's 6 hours of time you put into that. That if you tried to force it, you couldn't just do 7 hours straight and that last hour be ready to do it. It just doesn't work that
No,
way.
absolutely. Like, I think the best advice I ever got was I had an ex who used to say, are you tired? Are you going to do any work that you are going to like tonight? And I would always be like, no. And he'd be like, go to sleep.
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. And I am having to tell myself to do that lately. Like it is okay if today is just not a day where you're going to produce. And it's been like night and day. Like I had been very creatively blocked since, all of the pandemic stuff,
Oh,
because
yeah.
they're home all day, and I'm a single mom. So it's like, they're just on me all day long and things like that. So I haven't had that space. Like I've always been running around doing other things, and I'll try to sit down and force it. Nothing comes out. And I felt blocked about it. And as soon as I was like, you know what? Just because the kids are not here on a Saturday, I could be doing something, or I could just be okay. I could take a bath. I could do something that I want to do, or just have a lazy day. And sure enough, I end up with like 15 pages of random notes that I took to my, because I
Because it does
held.
make you more productive, like at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I feel better. I still feel
Absolutely.
recharged, even though like I really ended up doing work. I just had to make it okay that I didn't need to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's more important to keep your brain intact than it is to crank out pages.
It's amazing how few of us do that
It's true.
though. Well, we are at like an hour, so I feel like
Oh,
we've achieved. This was really cool. I am so glad that I didn't back out of doing this.
nice. Same. Yeah, this was super fun.
This was really fun, and it's just nice to talk about these things and share
Yeah.
experiences, and I'm grateful that we did it.
Yeah,
So
like this is why I like going to conventions, is like having like these kind of conversations.
yeah, and it's really cool to see that while there are things which are sort of a little bit different by genre, a lot of the process is the same, and so there is that sort of connection that way.
It does feel better knowing other people are like on the waves of
Exactly. We all have imposter syndrome. That's a real thing.
that is for sure true. They say this to you, but you don't believe it, and you're like,
Oh, that's what that is.
Yeah, like, oh, huh. So I guess I'll just feel like this until I grow old and die.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, and I've always said my favorite thing that I've always told myself is, when I'm writing a first draft, I write like I'm a god, and then I have to edit with humility. Like it's this
Oh,
idea,
that's good.
like in that moment, I have to believe that whatever I am doing is going to be the next masterpiece of literature.
Yeah, like I'm the
And I
best
can
writer
be anything
ever.
I want. I can take on any, I can move mountains, like, whatever it is. Then when I sit down and edit, I have to really back that off and be a totally different person and be like, what do I need to learn from? What do I need to do? I need to take advice. I need to accept that what I did the first time isn't.
It's almost like being your own, like, you know, if you were like a rock star, you were your own manager, like trying to get yourself to like
Yeah, and you like, almost literally have to put different hats on. It's just like, okay, today I am going to feel good about myself and I'm going to write. Tomorrow I am going to just feel awful about this and tear it apart.
right. And then follow that up with another good day.
Hopefully, if we're lucky.
Right.
Well, I will let you go and enjoy the rest of your Friday night.
Sweet. Yeah, enjoy your weekend as well.
Thank you. And yeah, it was really nice meeting you.
Yeah, it's nice meeting you too.
Bye.
Yeah.